So we have this marginal propensity to consume, which is effectively the slope. And in reality, slope matters in this model. Like for example, we always know it's going to slope upward, but if you have this really steep slope, I'm just going to call that y for right now, effectively what this is telling us is that really small changes in income have really dramatic impacts on spending. Conversely, if you have a really flat slope, you know, something kind of like this, maybe it's, I don't know if you can barely tell that's going up, so I'll, there. It's still slightly upward sloping, however, it's really flat, and effectively that's showing us that it takes a huge change in income before you really spend very much more money. So actually, in reality, slope does matter in this model. For us, we're probably just gonna go with easy art. You know, give me a nice, pretty 45-degree angle function, as opposed to, you know, really kind of trying to gauge what spending is like measured in the economy. But you can definitely see again that it does matter. You know, I guess I didn't fill in little dashes here. So you can definitely see the impact there. So, so that's kind of what we mean by, you know, marginal propensity to consume. I think I want to give it a quick definition here, so let me do that really fast. The marginal propensity to consume is the amount that consumption spending rises, the amount that consumption spending rises when disposable income rises by 1 unit. The amount that consumption spending rises when disposable income rises by 1 unit. That definition kind of gives us a basic mathematical interpretation. Again, now we're taking an algebraic view. If you think about that definition and you think about kind of unitary change and you know whatnot, effectively in reality at this point we would find a partial derivative. We're going to do an algebraic approach. Not as accurate, far more flexible, and a lot easier to do in video lecture. So mathematically, we can find MPC as our change in consumption, the amount that consumption spending rises, per our change in disposable income. So that's, again, that's a good algebraic take. You know, again, you can see kind of the deltas. You know, would look very similar to, you know, something if we were to do it in a calculus, delta C over our delta DI equation. You know, so I mean, again, you kind of have a very similar look. I guess I'm just going to clear that. I think you saw it. And it does allow us to do it as an algebraic interpretation. In terms of results, our MPC are always going to be depicted as a value between 0 and 1. And it effectively represents a percent. So if you get, say, 0.8 as your answer, effectively that's kind of showing that, you know, we spend 80% of our income. And it's interesting to kind of look at MPC because there's so many ways to measure MPC. It's one of our most utilized variables in you know, macroeconomic analysis, so like in publications and even discussions and things. And it's often one of the hardest ones to look at, quantify. You could always go and look up MPCs for society, but even the MPCs for society that the data leads you to, well, they might be different. There seems to be some differences in how people gather these. For example, do you include credit card spending? If you kind of think about this, when we made our money list and everything before, credit cards were never on our money list. We don't necessarily consider them money. We consider them a measure of debt. However, it is still consumption. So while we don't consider credit card as a monetary transaction, however you pay it off later, we do consider it part of consumption. So that gives us an interesting take then, because if you spend on your credit card, you could effectively spend more than your income, which would give you a value of greater than 1. You spend 108% of your income. If we take more of a monetary approach and say, no, we don't want to look at any kind of credit card expenditure because eventually you're going to use your income to pay that off. We just want to know out of your paycheck what portion of it goes to bills. Or to any kind of spending, and what portion of it goes to your savings account that you don't spend. And then all of a sudden you start getting a little bit lower of a number. So it's not uncommon to see some variance in society's MPC based on whether or not people were considering credit, considering debt as part of consumption. If they do, that MPC for the United States is likely going to be much higher. I've seen some that put it around like 98. We know that some people are saving in society, so some money's going into savings, but because people spend money they don't have, consumption, that pushes that really, really high. I've also seen it, a little bit closer to this value of 0.8. This is usually the value that I think that a lot of people kind of default to, that say, hey, if we look at total income in society and total money that's going into the savings, it tells us we're spending about 80% and saving about 20%, which we'll talk about like savings kind of built in here in just a second. So that's one thing that makes using MPC as a variable kind of tricky. There's another thing that makes it kind of tricky as well. We find that MPC kind of life cycles. It has different values at different parts of your life. Again, if we had a big class, we could try to kind of figure it out for our class, just, like thinking about over the course of a month and a year, what is your spending and savings rate? And I have results written down for a prior class, amazingly enough. And I found a class, I think this was, might have just been the last year. I think it was just last year. So the 2019 results showed that the class had an MPC that was an annualized MPC of about 70%. That in the summer, they were saving almost all of their income, and during the school year, they were spending almost all of their income, which kind of makes sense. So we kind of found out about an annualized rate of around 70%. And I have it written down, it was between 70 and 80. We find that at this point in your life, at early 20s, your MPC is likely very high. Your incomes are not very high, but being able to live is still important. So it basically takes your entire income. And we find that a lot of students are spending huge chunks of their income on just living expenses, food, etc. And that's going to continue into your early 20s. Your MPC is likely very, very, very high. As you graduate from college, you get that first job, and then you start seeing wage increases in that first job, and you start getting into your 30s, guess what you start doing? You start thinking about retirement. And if you're thinking about retirement, that means you're going to start saving more, saving more, saving more. And we find that your MPC starts to fall dramatically. You're spending less and starting to put more in savings. Again, and we even still can tie that to debt. We find that, by the time you're in your 30s, you're starting to pay off some of that debt. So some of that debt is disappearing, and you're not making those payments any longer. Hopefully student debt, right, going away, but maybe even things like car debt, house debt is maybe shrinking or something. So we start noticing that, while your MPC started really high in your teens, 20s, kind of your ages, and as you got older and older and older, it started going down, 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 and it really bottoms out around 40, right? By 40, a lot of your debt is paid off. Maybe even you're getting pretty far along in your house, getting it paid off. You're really thinking hardcore about retirement, and you're really going to start saving a lot. You're putting money, not spending it, you're putting it in some kind of savings form whether that is a savings account, whether that's a certificate of deposit. Somehow you are deliquifying your money. Then we notice it kind of starts to ramp back up again, right? You get to 50, 60, 70, well, what are you saving for at that point, right? You're retired. It's time to go out and travel. It's time to go out and buy that midlife crisis car, which I always think is kind of misnamed because, you probably wanted that car your whole life. You just couldn't afford it until you were like 50. So you can go out, you buy the midlife crisis car, you travel. Your income probably falls as you retire. You still receive, way over here, sorry. You still might receive some of those transfers, that Social Security, stuff like that. Maybe you work a part-time job. I see a ton of retired people at Walmart. So, you're not bringing in a lot and you're probably spending the vast majority of it. So all of a sudden, your MPC is really high again. So we kind of see this little again, kind of like circle of life effect. It starts really high, bottoms out, and then it returns really high as you get older. So it does make MPC kind of a tricky variable. We also do notice, we can look at world effects. We notice that industrial countries as a norm have a lower MPC than agrarian countries. There's more incentive to save in industrial countries. That is probably very, very, very correlated with income per capita. Typically in industrial countries, the income per capita is higher than agrarian countries. So you have money left over after buying everything you need to live. In agrarian countries, that might not be the case. We find that most agrarian countries have MPCs well into the 0.9 and upper 0.9 range, where there's very little savings at all in society. They're spending their entire income. So again, we kind of can make some interesting analysis with MPC. I've mentioned kind of this correlation quite a bit between MPC and savings. We actually do have a variable for savings. We call it MPS, which is the marginal propensity to save, right? So same everything, we just put in save. Marginal propensity to save. I could give you a definition, but it's going to sound almost like the MPC one, so I'm just going to kind of speed through it. If you want to rewind the video, you can. It's the amount that savings rises as our disposable income rises by $1. And again, it's going to be measured in this kind of scale of 0 to 1 because it's going to give us a percent. Now, if our MPC is 0.8, for example, our MPS would then have to be 0.2. We're spending 80%, we're saving 20% of our income. So you'll notice that mathematically, MPS is equal to 1 minus the MPC. And vice versa, right? You could algebraically rearrange this and you could show that MPC is equal to 1 minus the MPS. So we kind of have a way of determining that we do expect these two values to summate, add together to 1. Okay, so that's kind of a quick look at our MPC. Let's go ahead and pause it right there, and we'll get a board shot because we're going to have to do a board clear.